The Bell Witch or Bell Witch haunting is a legend from Southern folklore, centered on the 19th century Bell family of Adams, Tennessee. John Bell Sr., who made his living as a farmer, resided with his family along the Red River in northwest Robertson County in an area currently within the town of Adams. According to legend, from 1817 to 1821, his family and the local area came under attack by an invisible entity subsequently described as a witch. The entity was able to speak, affect the physical environment and change forms. Some accounts record the spirit with the capability to be in more than one place at a time, cross distances with rapid speed and the power of prophecy. In 1894, newspaper editor, Martin V. Ingram, published his authenticated history of the Bell Witch. The book is widely regarded as the first full-length record of the legend and a primary source for subsequent treatments. The individuals recorded in the work were known historical personalities. In modern times, some skeptics have regarded Ingram's efforts as a work of historical fiction or even fraud, rather than a nascent folklore study or accurate reflection of belief in the region during the 19th century. While not a fundamental element of the original recorded legend, the Bell Witch Cave in the 20th century became a source of continuing interest, belief, and generation of lore. Contemporary artistic interpretations such as in film and music have expanded the reach of the legend well beyond the regional confines of the southern United States. Synopsis. In his book An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, author Martin Van Buren Ingram published that the poltergeist's name was Kate, after the entity claimed at one point to be Old Kate Bat's witch, and continued to respond favorably to the name. The physical activity centered on the Bell's youngest daughter, Betsy, and her father, and Kate expressed particular displeasure when Betsy became engaged to a local named Joshua Gardner. The haunting began in late summer of 1817 when John Bell witnessed the apparition of a dog with the head of a rabbit. Bell fired at the animal but it disappeared. Activity moved into the home with sounds of scratching, knocking, and smacking lips with sheets being pulled from beds. The phenomenon grew in intensity as the entity pulled hair, slapped, pinched and stuck pins in the family with particular emphasis on Betsy. The Bells turned to a family friend James Johnston for help. After retiring for the evening at the Bell home, Johnston was awakened that night by the same phenomenon. That morning he told John Bell it was a spirit, just like in the Bible. Soon word of the haunting spread with some traveling great distances to see the witch. The apparition began to speak out loud and have full conversations and even at one point repeating word for word 2 sermons given 13 miles apart at the same time. John Johnston, a son of James, devised a test for the witch, something no one outside his family would know, asking the entity what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the slaves if she thought they did something wrong. The witch replied with his grandmother's accent, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" On another occasion, an Englishman stopped to visit and offered to investigate. On remarking on his family overseas, the witch suddenly began to mimic his English parents. Again at early morning, the witch woke him to voices of his parents worried as they had heard his voice as well. The Englishman quickly left that morning and later wrote to the Bell family the entity had visited his family in England and apologized for his skepticism. At times, the spirit displayed a form of kindness, especially towards Lucy, John Bell's wife, the most perfect woman to walk to earth. The witch would give Lucy fresh fruit and sing hymns to her, and showed John Bell Jr. a measure of respect. Referring to John Bell Sr. as Old Jack, the witch claimed she intended to kill him and signaled this intention through curses, threats and afflictions. The story climaxes with the Bell patriarch being poisoned by the witch. Afterward the entity interrupted the mourners by singing drinking songs. In 1821, soon after Betsy called off her engagement, the entity told the family it was going to leave, but return in 7 years in 1828. The witch returned on time to Lucy and her sons Richard and Joel with similar activities as before, but they chose not to encourage it, and the witch appeared to leave again. Several accounts say that during his military career, Andrew Jackson was intrigued with the story and his men were frightened away after traveling to investigate. In an independent oral tradition recorded in the vicinity of Panola County, Mississippi, the witch was the ghost of an unpleasant overseer John Bell murdered in North Carolina. In this tradition, the spirit falls in love with the central character Mary, leading to her death, reminiscent of vampire lore. The supernatural powers attributed to the Tennessee spirit have also been compared to that of Jinn in mythology. In the manuscript attributed to Richard Williams Bell, he writes of the spirit. Whether it was witchery, such as afflicted people in past centuries and the darker ages, whether some gifted fiend of hellish nature, practicing sorcery for selfish enjoyment, or some more modern science akin to that of mesmerism, or some hobgoblin native to the wilds of the country, or a disembodied soul shut out from heaven, or an evil spirit like those Paul drove out of the man into the swine, setting them mad, or a demon let loose from hell, I am unable to decide, nor has anyone yet divined its nature or cause for appearing, and I trust this description of the monster in all forms and shapes, and of many tongues, will lead experts who may come with a wiser generation, to a correct conclusion and satisfactory explanation. Williams Bell, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, Chapter 8. Early written sources. The Saturday Evening Post. The newspaper Green Mountain Freeman of Vermont on February 7, 1856 republished a story regarding the Bell Witch legend and ascribed the story to the Saturday Evening Post. The Freeman was affiliated with the abolitionist Liberty Party. The unidentified author described the apparition as the Tennessee Ghost or Bell Ghost, and stated the event occurred 30 years or more from the time the article was written. There are 3 human characters in the account: Mr. Bell, his daughter Betsy Bell, and Joshua Gardner. The author stated that the voice, which spoke freely about the house from all directions, would not manifest itself until the lights were extinguished at night. The phenomenon attracted wide interest. The author claimed to have become well acquainted with Mr. Gardner. When the ghost was asked how long it would remain, it replied, "Until Joshua Gardner and Betsy Bell get married." The author goes on to state that Betsy Bell had fallen in love with Joshua Gardner and had discovered the skill of ventriloquism. The author states that Ms. Bell then used her skill to attempt to convince Joshua Gardner to marry her. When they did not marry, the apparition disappeared. M.V. Ingram, in his An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, wrote that a Saturday Evening Post article regarding the Bell Witch had been retracted. About 1849 the Saturday Evening Post, published either at Philadelphia or New York, printed a long sketch of the Bell Witch phenomenon, written by a reporter who made a strenuous effort in the details to connect her with the authorship of the demonstrations. Mrs. Powell was so outraged by the publication that she engaged a lawyer to institute suit for libel. The matter, however, was settled without litigation, the paper retracting the charges, explaining how this version of the story had gained credence, and the fact that at the time the demonstrations commenced Betsy Bell had scarcely advanced from the stage of childhood and was too young to have been capable of originating and practicing so great a deception. The fact also that after this report had gained circulation, she had submitted to any and every test that the wits of detectives could invent to prove the theory, and all the stratagems employed, served only to demonstrate her innocence and utter ignorance of the agency of the so-called witchery, and was herself the greatest sufferer from the affliction. Martin V. Ingram, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, Chapter 9. Murder of James Smith, 1868. In September 1868, an article was published entitled Witchcraft and Murder, Hobgoblins and Old Grey Horses: The Incentive to Crime. Tom Clinard and Dick Burgess were arrested for the murder of James Smith. It was reported that Smith claimed the powers of witchcraft while working near Adams Station chopping wood on a farm with the defendants. The article stated Smith claimed to use these occult powers on Clinard and Burgess, leading to the conflict. Ingram published an interview with Lucinda E. Rawls, of Clarksville, Tennessee, daughter of Alexander Gooch and Nenny Thorne, both reported as close friends of Betsy Bell. Rawls testified that the Bell Witch was a frequent topic of conversation during her lifetime and pointed to a murder of a man for witchcraft as evidence for this claim. The Bell Witch was, and is still, a great scapegoat. Every circumstance out of the regular order of things is attributed to the witch. It has not been long since a man claiming to be the witch was waylaid and murdered by two men who were cleared, on the plea that the murdered man had bewitched them. Lucinda Rawls, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, Chapter 12. Ingram appended a date of 1875 or 1876 to the bloodshed, but connected the Rawls recollection with the death of James Smith. Smith came into the community a stranger, and was employed by Mr. Fletcher, where Clinard and Burgess were also engaged on the farm. Smith professed to be something of a wizard, or rather boasted of his power to hypnotize and lay spells on people, subjecting anyone who came under his influence to his will, and it was reported that he claimed to have derived this power from the mantle of the Bell Witch. However, the writer interviewed Honorable John F. House, who was counsel for the defense, on the subject, who says that no such evidence was produced in the trial, but that the lawyers handled the Bell Witch affair for all that it was worth in the defense of their clients, presenting the analogy or similarity of circumstances with good effect on the jury. Martin V. Ingram, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch, Chapter 12. Haunted House, 1880. On April 28, 1880, an article was published regarding a haunted house in Springfield, Tennessee, where knocking on the floor was heard. The author reported that several hundred people visited the home attempting to witness the phenomenon, with many camped out overnight despite the homeowners asking them to leave. The author of the article took the opportunity to mention the Bell Witch legend. It is an actual fact that several hundred intelligent people of Springfield and vicinity have been so excited over the noise as to go night after night to listen to it. About 30 years ago, Robertson County had a sensation similar to this known as the Bell Witch, and people came from all parts of the country, even as far as New York, to hear or see her. The journal Studies in Philology, in 1919, published a study of witchcraft in North Carolina by folklorist Tom Pete Cross. Cross cites a column from the Nashville Banner where it mentions the paper had sent a reporter to Robertson County in the 1880s, John C. Cook, to investigate reports of the possible re-emergence of Bell Witch phenomenon. Nashville Centennial Exposition. Another account of the Bell Witch legend was reportedly published in 1880 as a part of a sketch of Robertson County written for Nashville's Centennial Exposition. The author of the article is unknown and the article is undated. Dates in the sketch end at 1880. In this account, the Bell entity did not explicitly poison John Bell. At one time a vial of poison was found in the flue of the chimney, and being taken down, Dr. George B. Hobson gave one drop to a cat, causing its death in 7 seconds. The witch claimed to have put the poison there for the purpose of killing Mr. Bell. Being asked how it was going to administer the poison, it said by pouring it into the dinner pot. It is remarkable that, although he enjoyed good health up to the time of this event, Mr. Bell died within days after the vial was found, being in a stupor at the time of his death. From this time the people visited the house less frequently, although the witch would now and then be heard. This is in contrast to the Ingram account, attributed to Richard Williams Bell, where John Bell was already suffering from an unknown affliction and bedridden for some time. John Bell's son, John Bell Jr., found the vial in the cupboard after his father did not wake. The family called for Dr. Hobson, while the Bell Witch exclaimed she had fed the poison to John Bell. Alex Gunn and John Bell Jr. tested the poison on the cat with a straw, which died very quick. John Bell died the next day on December 20, 1820. In the Centennial sketch, the entity described itself as one of 7 spirits with 3 names given by the author: Three Waters, Tine Purdy, and Black Dog. The Ingram account also described a family of spirits. In addition to Kate, the other members of the family had the names of Black Dog, Mathematics, Sapocryphy, and Jerusalem. Black Dog was described as the apparent leader of the group. Goodspeed's History of Tennessee. Goodspeed Brothers' 1886 History of Tennessee, published roughly 65 years after the initial purported events, recorded a short account of the legend. The paragraph does not mention Andrew Jackson or the elder Bell's death. A remarkable occurrence, which attracted widespread interest, was connected with the family of John Bell, who settled near what is now Adams Station about 1804. So great was the excitement that people came from hundreds of miles around to witness the manifestations of what was popularly known as the Bell Witch. This witch was supposed to be some spiritual being having the voice and attributes of a woman. It was invisible to the eye, yet it would hold conversation and even shake hands with certain individuals. The freaks it performed were wonderful, and seemingly designed to annoy the family. It would take the sugar from the bowls, spill the milk, take the quilts from the beds, slap and pinch the children, and then laugh at the discomfiture of its victims. At first it was supposed to be a good spirit, but its subsequent acts, together with the curses with which it supplemented its remarks, proved the contrary. A volume might be written concerning the performances of this wonderful being, as they are now described by contemporaries and their descendants. That all this actually occurred will not be disputed, nor will a rational explanation be attempted. It is merely introduced as an example of superstition, strong in the minds of all but a few in those times, and not yet wholly extinct. Accounts from 1890. An article was published February 3, 1890 describing a series of events from Adams Station, Tennessee. At dusk, January 27, 1890, Mr. Holloway reported watching 2 unknown women arrive at his home and dismount from their horses as he was feeding cattle. When he arrived at the house, the horses and women were gone. Mr. Holloway's wife reported seeing the women in the yard as well. That week, Mr. Rowland attempted to place a sack of corn on his horse's back and it fell off. He again attempted to place the sack of corn on the horse's back several more times, but each time the sack fell off. Joe Johnson arrived and held on to the sack as Mr. Holloway mounted his horse. They witnessed the sack floating away for 20 yards where it settled down at the fence. When the men went to retrieve the sack, a voice was heard, "You won't touch this sack anymore." A follow-up report was published on February 18, 1890 with the title, "A Weird Witch, More Tales of a Mulhattenish Flavor from Adams Station." In the late 19th century, Joseph Mulhattan was a known hoaxer of newspaper articles. The article was republished a few days later with the subtitle "More Tales of a Fishy Flavor." In the account, the entity was referred to only as the witch. The article reports that a Mr. Johnson was visiting Buck Smith and were discussing a recent visitation of the ghost at his home. They heard a knocking at the door, and when they opened the door, the knocking began at another door. They sat down and the dog began to fight with something invisible. 2 minutes later, the door flew open and fire spread across the room blown by a cyclonic wind with the coals disappearing as they tried to put it out. That evening Mr. Johnson started home on his horse and something jumped on the back grabbing his shoulder as he tried to restrain the horse. He felt it jump off as he neared his home and move in the leaves into the woods. A Mr. Winters reported taking a peculiar bird while hunting with great difficulty. After he returned home, he opened the game bag to discover the bird had disappeared and in place was a rabbit which then also disappeared. While burning vegetation outdoors, Mr. Rowland described a visit at 9 p.m. of a half-clothed black man with one eye in his forehead that directed Mr. Rowland to follow him and dig at a large rock. The figure then disappeared. Mr. Rowland dug that night until exhaustion. He received help the next morning from Bill Burgess and Mr. Johnson and discovered something described as a kettle turned bottom upward. They were unable to remove it as the soil began moving back into the hole. The report concludes saying that many people were visiting to see the witch. Martin Van Buren Ingram. Biography. Born near Guthrie, Kentucky, June 20, 1832, Martin Van Buren Ingram took over responsibility of the family farm at the age of 17. A member of Hawkins' Nashville Battalion during the Civil War, he was discharged for disability after the Battle of Shiloh. Ingram began his editing and publishing career in April 1866 with the Robertson Register with no previous experience. October 1868, Ingram moved the paper to Clarksville and began issuing the Clarksville Tobacco Leaf in February 1869. Ingram continued an association with the Leaf until about 1881. The consequences of poor health, family tragedy, and fire limited his continuing interest in the newspaper industry. On the occasion of Ingram's death in October 1909, editor of the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle, W. W. Barksdale, wrote of his friend and colleague, "We doubt exceedingly if there ever lived a man who performed as much self-sacrificing labor to further the interests of the community in which he lived. He became a citizen of Clarksville 40 years ago, and from that time practically until the day of his death his greatest concern was the advancement and welfare of his adopted town and county. A man of true mold, he despised all deceit, trickery, and littleness, and with a courage which nothing could daunt, he laid on the journalistic lash unsparingly whenever he thought the occasion required. Naturally, his was not a pathway strewn with roses, his was an aggressive nature, a fact which often brought him into serious collision with those with whom he took issue. Time, however, usually justified him in the positions which he assumed." W. W. Barksdale, Clarksville Leaf Chronicle. An authenticated history of the famous Bell Witch. Ingram was reported, February 19, 1890, to have retired as editor from the Clarksville Chronicle. Ingram subsequently traveled to Chicago in October 1893, while editor of the Progress Democrat, to attempt to publish his unauthenticated history of the famous Bell Witch. The wonder of the 19th century, an unexplained phenomenon of the Christian era. The mysterious talking goblin that terrorized the west end of Robertson County, Tennessee, tormenting John Bell to his death. The story of Betsy Bell, her lover, and the haunting Sphinx. In late March 1894, it was announced a publisher, W. P. Titus, in Clarksville would print the work, and it was released a few months later. The publisher reported a delay in printing after the witch visited one night in early May. Titus claimed the witch demonstrated with maniacal singing, laughter, prayers, moaning, clapping, and rattling of the roof. The phenomena caused the printers to evacuate. In the introduction to the book, Ingram published a letter dated July 1, 1891 from former TN State Representative James Allen Bell of Adairville, Kentucky. J. A. Bell, a son of Richard Williams Bell and a grandson of John Bell Sr., explained that his father had met with his brother John Bell Jr. before his death, and they agreed no material he had collected should be released until the last immediate family member of John Bell Sr. had died. The last immediate member of the family and youngest child of John Bell Sr., Joel Egbert Bell, died in 1890 at the age of 77. Now, nearly 75 years having elapsed, the old members of the family who suffered the torments having all passed away, and the witch story still continues to be discussed as widely as the family name is known, under misconception of the facts, I have concluded that in justice to the memory of an honored ancestry, and to the public also whose minds have been abused in regard to the matter, it would be well to give the whole story to the world. J. A. Bell, 1891 letter, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch. J. A. Bell expressed the belief that his father's manuscript was written when he was 35 years old in 1846. He claimed his father gave him the manuscript and family notes shortly before his death in 1857. Richard Williams Bell was roughly 6 to 10 years of age during the initial manifestations of the Bell Witch phenomenon and 17 at the occurrence of the spirit's return in 1828. The reported contributions of Richard Williams Bell, approximately 90 pages in length, are recorded in Chapter 8 of Ingram's work, entitled Our Family Trouble. According to Brian Dunning, no one has ever seen this diary, and there is no evidence that it ever existed. Conveniently, every person with first-hand knowledge of the Bell Witch hauntings was already dead when Ingram started his book. In fact, every person with second-hand knowledge was even dead. Dunning also concluded that Ingram was guilty of falsifying another statement, that the Saturday Evening Post had published a story in 1849 accusing the Bell's daughter Elizabeth of creating the witch, an article which was not found at the time. Joe Nickell argues the chapter includes the use of Masonic themes and anachronism which impacts credibility. Jim Brooks, native of Adams, writes in his work Bell Witch Stories You Never Heard, that Bell family descendants report that Ingram did not return the manuscript to the family. Brooks explores the possibility that Ingram would have had an enhanced opportunity to modify the story by not returning the papers. The account of General Andrew Jackson's visit is confined to Chapter 11 of Ingram's work. The chapter is a letter from Colonel Thomas L. Yancey, an attorney in Clarksville, dated January 1894. Yancey relates that his grandfather, Whitmore Fort, was a witness to phenomena at the Bell homestead and had related the story of Jackson's visit, which was undated in the letter. Paranormal investigator Benjamin Radford, as well as Brian Dunning, conclude that there is no evidence that Andrew Jackson visited the Bell family home. During the years in question, Jackson's movements were well documented, and nowhere in history or his writings is there evidence of his knowledge of the Bell family. According to Dunning, the 1824 presidential election was notoriously malicious, and it seems hard to believe that his opponent would have overlooked the opportunity to drag him through the mud for having lost a fight to a witch. Keith Cartwright of the University of North Florida compares Ingram's work with Uncle Remus' FolkLore as recorded by Joel Chandler Harris and also as an expression of the psychological shame of slavery and Native American removal. The slaves in the account are regarded as experts on the witch, with Uncle Zeke identifying the witch as, "Dat Injun spirit, the Injuns was here fust, and we white folks drive 'em out, all but dem war were dead and couldn't go, and daw's here yet, in der spirit." The figure of Progress General Andrew Jackson was brought nearly to heel and the master, John Bell, was dead. The role of the trickster not played by the Brer rabbit but the witch rabbit, the spirit's common animal form. The displaced, blacks, widows and girls, act as witness to a force polite society cannot comprehend. The witch appears as a catch-all for every remainder of resistant agency. Events in the 20th century. A prophecy was reported in 1903 that the witch could return on the centennial of the Bell family arrival in Tennessee. By September, a local paper was incredulous as she was not reported to have returned in August. Charles Bailey Bell, a grandson of John Bell Jr., and neurologist in Nashville, published a book entitled The Bell Witch, A Mysterious Spirit in 1934. In the work, he recounted stories told to him by his great-aunt Betsy later in her life. This included another account of Andrew Jackson's visit and of a boy trapped in the Bell Witch Cave and pulled out of the cave feet first by the witch. Bell also detailed a purported series of prophecies given to his ancestors in 1828 by the spirit, including the claim the witch was set to return in 1935, 107 years after her last visit to the Bell family. In 1937, there were reports of quirky events. Lewis Garrison, owner of the farm that included the Bell Witch Cave, heard unexplained noises coming from inside. Bell descendants described the sound of something rubbing against a house, a paper-like object that flew out the door and re-entered through a side door, and faint music heard from a piano. A group from the local Epworth League were reported to have attended a wiener roast in a rock quarry near the Bell Witch Cave on July 29, 1937. The group were joking about the legend when they saw a figure of a woman sitting on top of the cliff over the cave, causing many to flee. According to the newspaper, a minister in the group later claimed to have investigated and discovered it was moonlight on a rock. The second report concluded with a weather report that the moon was barely noticeable that night. Jim Brooks published in 2015 that his mother was in attendance at the roast, and relates that the minister caught up to the youth on the road to town after discovering no explanation for the figure. In November 1965, an article was published involving an antique oak rocking chair said to have been previously owned by attorney Charlie Willett, a Bell descendant. The rocking chair was recently sold in an estate sale to Mrs. J.C. Adams, owner of an antique store on US 41. A customer sat down in the chair, after learning it was not for sale, and while rocking in the chair asked Mrs. Adams if she believed in the supernatural. 2 weeks later, the customer's daughter visited the home of Mrs. Adams and said after her mother had left and visited the Bell Cemetery, a voice told her to stand up and look around, "You will find something of much value." After some car trouble, the woman walked out into a field and found a black iron kettle turned over. She turned the kettle over and found a pearl buckle in the grass. The woman's daughter reported a jeweler estimated the buckle to be 160 to 200 years old. Bonnie Hanneline, in 1977, recounted a time during her childhood in 1944 when she was exploring the cave. She left English class, playing hooky, and borrowed a lantern from Mrs. Garrison, the cave owner. She reported to have explored the cave with her friends for several years. While she was inside, her lantern blew out despite no breeze inside the cave. She managed to relight the lantern and it blew out again. Terrified, she crawled along the water path of the cave in the dark until she reached the entrance, where she saw an opened can of pork and beans and marshmallows. Later that evening, she learned law enforcement discovered 2 escaped fugitives in the back of the cave. She credited the witch with helping her avoid them. A visit in 1977 was reported of a Group 5 soldiers from nearby Fort Campbell to the Bell Witch Cave. One of the soldiers was sitting on a rock and expressed skepticism of the legend when something invisible grabbed him around the chest. In 1986, staff writer David Gerard for the Tennessean and photographer Bill Wilson, the latter also a member of the National Speleological Society, were given permission to sleep in the cave overnight. While in the first cave room they heard a noise from deeper in the cave Gerard estimated at 30 yards. Subsequently, an unwavering groan repeated again with greater volume and accompanied by several loud thumps. When it began a third time, the men retreated to the gate entrance. They explored the wiring to the lights looking for a reason for the noises. They went back to the first cave room but heard a rumble near the entrance. Walking back to the entrance, they discovered the rumble was noise from a jet. As they reached the gate, a loud, high-pitched scream emanated from inside the cave. The journalists left and did not spend the night. In 1987, H.C. Sanders, owner of A.N.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.